Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Delain, titled The Human Contradiction. So recently, I was watching one of the new React videos from the Fine Brothers, specifically the one the YouTubers react to baby metal. Now, for those of you who don't know, baby metal is a band fusing J-pop and heavy metal, amongst other genres, and honestly, not really my thing. But one of the questions that the Fine Brothers asked, they got me thinking, would there be a way to fuse pop music and heavy metal in a way that was accessible to the mainstream public? Because when we look back through the Billboard charts, the times when metal has crossed over into the mainstream has been due to rock trends of the time, the punk and post-punk movements of the 70s, hair metal in the 80s, and new metal and post-grunge in the 90s and 2000s. But if you were to skip the conventional definition of rock altogether, which might be necessary considering how little airplay rock gets on the charts, in order to fuse metal and conventional pop, how would you might do it? Well, in my opinion, we kind of already have done this. We already have something of an answer to this, and that lies in what I like to call the most accessible genre of metal from the outside, symphonic metal. Often featuring clean vocals, pretty and upbeat melodies, soaring choruses. Well, that was the method I got into metal, and with the commercial success of a band like Evanescence, it's proven to work. And if I were looking to answer one of my recent questions of how could I, as a newcomer, get into symphonic metal, I now have an answer to that. If you're coming from pop music, Delain, the Dutch symphonic metal act formed in 2002 by former with Instrumentation keyboardist Martin Westerholt, and who might be, without a doubt, the most commercially accessible symphonic metal act I've ever heard. Let me stress, that's not exactly a bad thing. I've stressed a number of times that pop music is worth defending, and a transitory step between the two genres, or a crossover between the two genres, that's not a bad thing. However, Delain strikes me as a band that instead of effectively blending the two genres, instead chose to water down the metal side rather significantly. The highest praise that I can give the band is the lead vocalist Charlotte Wessels. She's a really good singer, with a lot of emotion and range, but the melodic progressions are very simplistic and not all that interesting. The guitar solos are inexcusably basic, and the production is pretty shallow at best. On top of that, the band seems to often have a very painfully high school sensibility when it comes to the lyrics, which can make some of the self-esteem and social commentary anthems come across as more than a little overwrought and lacking in nuance. And look, while symphonic metal lyrics are often arch or borderline irrelevant, here the arch subject matter strikes as a little bit pandering to the audience to me, and that just rubs me the wrong way. Let me stress that I don't think Delain is a bad band, but look, in a symphonic metal landscape that has Nightwish, Tarja, with Instrumentation, Epica, and plenty of others, Delain doesn't really stand out for me. But you know what? I figured I'd give them another chance with their newest album, The Human Contradiction. How was it? Well, frankly, it's exactly what I would have expected from Delain. And though it's heavier, I wouldn't exactly classify it as better, and it's not an album to which I can see myself returning to in the future. And as I've mentioned before with previous Delain releases, it's not bad, but I don't think the band has stepped up their game enough to compete in the real big leagues with some of the heavyweights. And while the band does have a few interesting ideas on this album, they don't exactly execute them in a way that would suggest more imagination that they would need to compete. So okay, to explain all that, we need to first talk about instrumentation and production. And I'll say the one big net positive for this album as a whole, we're getting to see more of the band's strengths as they chose to go in a heavier direction. The guitar work is a little bit meatier, we get some respectable solos for once, and the drumming does show some more sophisticated progressions that I did like. I wish I could say the same thing for the melody lines though, and here's where we run into my consistent issue with Delain. The melodic hooks are just a little simplistic and really don't show a lot of variety in between songs, mostly sticking with 3 or 4 note progressions that are really kind of basic. This especially comes across when most of the melody lines are carried by the keyboards and not by the guitars, which can lead to some admittedly harder riffing songs that have a lot of power and energy starting to run together and feeling a little interchangeable at points. Now, thankfully, the production does give the guitars some more depth and crackle in the mix, although it's very evident evident that the greater focus on the keyboard, synths, and Charlotte Wessels' vocals. And while the symphonic elements were solid enough, I honestly preferred the electronic elements in the mix and in the production, because with a relatively thin orchestration and not a great variety in the instrumentation that they choose to use, the electronic elements, they at least gave Delain some greater unique personality. Now, thankfully, Charlotte Wessels was on hand for another very solid vocal performance, and honestly, she's probably the strongest or most distinctive member of the band, capable of a very broad emotional range, and she's very good here. Unfortunately, the choice of guest stars is a little bit shaky, as George Ustoek is solid for Tell Me Mechanist, but arch-enemy frontwoman Alyssa White-Glutz seems to fade into the background on Tragedy of the Commons, and that's just sad and unfortunate. I think this is more of an issue with the production than the delivery, because the mix placement of Nightwish bassist and vocalist Marco Helada is also slightly behind Wessels, as was Alyssa's. And incidentally, if Marco's presence wasn't indicative that Delain was trying to imitate Nightwish with a social justice angle, I don't know what is, and honestly, that struck me as a little bit cheap. Now this takes us to the lyrics and theme, and we could really call this album We Are the Others Part 2, because we get a lot of similarly sketched social justice themes that are very broadly presented and not particularly well realized. Now, sure, Your Body is a Battleground, My Masquerade, Tell Me Mechanist, and Tragedy of the Commons, they do touch on themes such as pharmaceutical abuse, over-reliance on technology, which can distance you from humanity, oppression for being different. You get the drill. Hell, Tragedy of the Commons tries to make an environmentalist argument with economic theory in the growl lyrics. That's an interesting idea. But then it just resolves into pessimism in the lyrics, and Wessels' delivery just suggesting just to bitterly give up, because it's not as if she can change anything. And that sense of sourness comes across on more than a few songs of this record. The opening track, Here Comes the Vulture, seems overloaded with sarcasm when Wessels realizes that she's not getting everything she wants and that she's just gonna play the same old song, which, by the way, isn't a good thing, and honestly, that came across as more than a little petulant. This is an underlying attitude that really kills the populism of the social justice side of this album. The sense that Wessels never really includes herself in the framing of the situations. The pronoun is always you when it comes to the hard topics, reserving I for songs like The Masquerade, where she can fly her freak flag high and nobody will ever judge her and her mysterious partner. Look, I can appreciate the dark romance angle that the song is trying to cultivate, but for a social justice-inspired album, and for the greater themes, why hide that freak flag? That seems to run contrary to your entire message. Even my favorite song of the album, Army of the Dolls, a song that looks to incorporate some goth rock-inspired tighter electronica for some pop appeal, and it actually comes through really well, and when talking about conformity through body shaming, I thought the song was really well written and composed. It's still a song that's pointed at somebody else. And look, I don't buy the argument that she's simply using the universal you, and that she's including herself implicitly, because the lyrics imply actions that she's taking from outside of the overall picture. What this all means is that the songs, they just come across as really preachy to me, and the social justice angle feels so sour and underweight, it just comes across as really self-centered and not something that works for me. And as an album that's claiming gothic influences instrumentally, the lyrics come across as having the necessary flavor, but lacking the spirit of populism that ultimately undercuts a fair amount of the gothic theme. But then you realize the truth of it all. This is an album that will unintentionally speak very well to teenage self-absorption, giving the listeners the feeling of not being part of the machine without the nuance to really back that assertion up, which honestly, that's a very pop attitude. And it's that pop attitude to both lyrical and instrumental composition that ultimately makes Delain such a really frustrating contradiction of a band. They have the sound and they have the instrumentation of symphonic metal act on the surface. But if you go any deeper into the composition and you just don't find enough complexity in the melodies or lyrics to really back it up. And since they're looking to move to a heavier sound, they're looking to be judged as a symphonic metal band. You know what, I'm sorry, I'm giving them a 6 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you're looking for that bridge act between modern pop or symphonic metal and you're not willing to try out Nightwish or With Temptation. Even with that, honestly, you're better off picking up Dark Passion Play or Hydra, or even Taria's most recent album, Colors in the Dark, because they're a better fit than this. Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this review is going to make a couple of you very angry, especially those of you who asked for this. Look, there's better symphonic metal acts out there. You just got to look for them. If there's any other albums you'd like me to cover coming up, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm more than happy to hear about it. So until then, I'm Mark, and I'll see you next time.